U.S. military planning currently stands as an alternative to relying purely on airstrikes. What I'm not going to do is walk through entry points, unit composition, breach sequencing, or how a demolition operation against either site would actually be conducted. That's not because the information isn't circulating, it clearly is. It's because narrating an operational plan for a real facility in a live war isn't news commentary anymore. It's a targeting document. And I don't think a channel like this should be in the business of producing one, regardless of how many other outlets are speculating about the details. What I can tell you, at the level this deserves to be discussed, is the actual strategic picture the experts quoted in this reporting are wrestling with. Joseph Rogers at CSIS told the Post that if negotiations continue going nowhere, a military operation may end up being the most realistic path to actually getting Iran's nuclear material out of the equation, rather than just repeatedly bombing facilities that keep getting rebuilt or relocated. Richard Goldberg, who ran counter-proliferation policy for Iran at the White House during Trump's first term, raised the obvious, brutal logistics question. How do you sustain a large ground force deep inside Iran, long enough to actually complete an extraction or demolition mission and still get everyone out safely? A question that doesn't have a clean answer, given how far both sites sit from any friendly border. And CBS News, in its own reporting on the same broader debate a few months back, quoted a former Marine and national security analyst calling an operation like this potentially the riskiest, and possibly the largest, special operations mission in American history, explicitly invoking the failed 1980 Eagle Claw hostage rescue mission as the kind of catastrophic outcome military planners are acutely aware could happen again. That's the real weight of this story, not the tactical specifics, but the fact that senior people across multiple administrations and think tanks are treating a ground mission into hardened, defended Iranian territory as a genuinely live option precisely because the alternative, sustained bombing that Iran keeps working around by hardening and relocating its material, hasn't produced a clean resolution either. There's also a detail worth adding for accuracy that complicates the urgency framing a little. The Wall Street Journal's own reporting on Pickaxe Mountain specifically has noted that, as of its most recent assessment, the site does not appear to be currently in use for active nuclear work, which doesn't make the site irrelevant. Iran clearly considers it valuable enough to have moved thousands of centrifuges there and to keep expanding its defenses, but it's a meaningfully different picture than a facility actively producing weapons-grade material right now, and that distinction matters for how urgent any decision about it actually needs to be. Now let's move to the missile story, because this one is real, well-documented, and doesn't require me to withhold anything, since it's straightforward reporting on a weapon's known, publicly discussed characteristics, rather than a plan for using one. The Wall Street Journal reported that Iran has been increasingly relying on and refining its Kheibar Shekan ballistic missile, a solid-fuel, satellite-guided weapon with a range of roughly 900 miles that Iran has used, according to U.S. officials cited in the report, in the recent strike on Jordan's Muwafaq Salti air base that killed 3 American service members. What makes this missile a genuine emerging problem, according to missile expert Fabian Hintz, is that its warhead maneuvers during the descent phase specifically to defeat interceptors, and Iran is treating every combat launch as a data-gathering opportunity, refining which flight paths and speed variations work best against American and Allied defenses with each use. A U.S. official told the Journal most of these missiles are still being intercepted, but a meaningful and apparently growing number are getting through, and the economics of this fight matter too. Each Kheibar Shekan reportedly costs Iran a fraction of what a single American or Israeli interceptor costs to fire back at it, somewhere between $2 and $15 million depending on the interceptor system, which is exactly the kind of cost asymmetry that favors the side doing the attacking over the side stuck constantly defending. On Israel, tonight's picture is genuinely tense, and there's a real specific event driving some of it that's worth naming directly. Senator Lindsey Graham, one of the most consistently hawkish pro-Israel voices in the U.S. Senate, and a personal friend of Netanyahu's, died unexpectedly on July 11th at 71. His funeral, delayed by a couple of weeks, is now set for Tuesday at Washington's National Cathedral, and Netanyahu is flying in to attend it, using the trip as the occasion for what will be his first in-person meeting with Trump since the two countries launched their joint campaign against Iran back on February 28th. I want to flag something about the timing of that meeting that adds real context. Multiple Israeli outlets have reported the White House had actually been holding off on scheduling a formal Trump-Netanyahu sit-down for weeks, in part because Netanyahu's approval ratings have been sliding in both American parties, and in part because Trump's own team has reportedly been wary of the optics of the U.S., appearing to be pulled into a bigger war by Israel, specifically if a major new offensive follows too closely on the heels of a photographed meeting between the two leaders. That's a genuinely revealing detail about how carefully the optics of escalation are being managed on the American side, separate from whatever the actual military planning looks like. Graham's own history here adds a real human through line to why this meeting carries so much weight. Netanyahu has publicly recounted a recent conversation in which Graham told him directly, in Netanyahu's own retelling, that Israel had to eliminate Iran's nuclear program before it could be used against Israel first. So this funeral is, in a strange and genuinely poignant way, bringing together the two leaders most associated with pushing this confrontation forward, at a moment when the decision about whether to escalate again sits squarely in front of both of them. On the Israeli defensive posture specifically, public shelters have now reopened in additional cities, including Kiryat Gat, Carmiel, and Eilat, joining Ramat Gan, and Israeli officials describe the country as being at its highest state of readiness ahead of a possible escalation, with the Security Cabinet meeting Thursday and the full cabinet scheduled to convene Sunday. Israeli officials are also reportedly telling reporters they believe this crisis is moving steadily toward a wider confrontation rather than away from one, which is about as direct a signal as you tend to get from officials who are otherwise careful not to publicly predict military outcomes. On the American side, Trump told Axios this week that he's actively considering restarting a scale of combat operations against Iran larger than what the U.S. and Israel carried out during the original 12-day war before the ceasefire, and separately warned Fox News that if Iran doesn't return to the table, the U.S. will strike infrastructure facilities and bridges, repeating the same doctrine we've tracked across several updates now. On the satellite imagery specifically, independent open-source intelligence trackers have documented U.S. aircraft at Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia moving into dispersed combat-ready positions, including E-3 AWACS early warning planes, with more than 20 refueling tankers visible at that base alone. And reporting suggests roughly 80 more tankers positioned in Israel, putting the total CENTCOM tanker presence in the region somewhere around 100 aircraft. Dispersing aircraft like this, rather than keeping them clustered together on a single ramp, is a standard defensive precaution specifically taken when planners assess a real elevated risk of incoming attack, since a concentrated group of parked aircraft is a far more efficient target than the same aircraft spread across a wider area. And the scale of tanker positioning specifically tells you the U.S. is preparing for the kind of sustained large-scale air operation that would require extensive mid-air refueling support, not just another single night of the strikes we've grown accustomed to over the past several weeks. And there's one more piece of NYT reporting from tonight worth flagging, honestly, because it complicates the Iran is on the ropes framing that's been common in a lot of coverage lately. The Times reports that hardliners inside Iran's regime are, if anything, in a stronger internal position right now, arguing that possessing a nuclear weapon is the only way to prevent future attacks like the ones the country has endured since February. And satellite imagery separately shows Iran rapidly rebuilding sites that were hit in earlier rounds of strikes. That's a genuinely important data point for understanding why the diplomatic track keeps struggling to produce results, even when both sides occasionally signal openness to talks, because it suggests that domestic political incentives inside Iran right now may be pushing toward doubling down on the nuclear program specifically rather than trading it away, which is close to the opposite of what a negotiated settlement would require to actually succeed. So here's where I think tonight leaves us. The Special Forces planning story is real and serious, and it tells you the U.S. genuinely doesn't have a clean, low-risk option for dealing with Iran's remaining nuclear material. Airstrikes keep running into hardened, relocated targets. And a ground operation carries the kind of catastrophic risk profile serious military historians keep comparing to Eagle Claw. The missile story tells you Iran's remaining conventional deterrent is adapting faster than some earlier assessments assumed, learning from every engagement in a way that's eroding the cost advantage American and allied air defenses are supposed to hold. And the Israel picture, tied together by Tuesday's Trump-Netanyahu meeting happening at Lindsey Graham's funeral of all places, suggests the decision point everyone's been anticipating for weeks may genuinely be close now. Not because any single piece of tonight's news proves it on its own, but because the shelters, the tanker dispersal, the cabinet meetings, and the timing of the first in-person Trump-Netanyahu sit-down since the war began are all pointing in the same direction at once. There are a couple more threads worth adding before I close, because they round out the picture of where both the diplomatic and military tracks actually stand heading into next week. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said this week that Trump wants more than proportional retaliation against Iran, language that's genuinely significant coming from the country's top diplomat rather than just from Trump himself in a press gaggle, since it suggests the administration's actual internal posture has shifted from measured, tit-for-tat responses towards something explicitly designed to be disproportionate, a doctrine that fits with everything else we've discussed tonight about tanker positioning and aircraft dispersal being consistent with preparation for a larger operation rather than another routine night of strikes. It's also worth remembering what Lindsey Graham was actually working on in his final weeks, because it adds real context to why his funeral has become such a significant diplomatic moment rather than just a somber one. Graham had been pushing hard for Saudi Arabia to normalize relations with Israel as part of a broader expansion of the Abraham Accords, an effort that remains very much unfinished business. And having Trump, Netanyahu, and a wide range of American lawmakers and foreign dignitaries gathered at the National Cathedral on Tuesday creates exactly the kind of informal diplomatic setting where conversations about Iran, the Accords, and the war's next phase are almost certainly going to happen around the edges of the formal service, whatever gets announced publicly afterward. I also want to go back to the cost asymmetry point on the Kheibar Shekan missile, because I think it's actually one of the more important structural facts in tonight's update. And it's easy to let it slide past as a single interesting detail, rather than sitting with what it actually implies. A war where the attacking side can produce and launch missiles for a small fraction of what it costs the defending side to shoot each one down is not a war that favors the defender over time, regardless of how many individual missiles get successfully intercepted on any given night. Because the economics only have to break down once when defenders run low on interceptors faster than they can be resupplied, for the practical effectiveness of the entire defensive umbrella to change. That's part of why the Patriot interceptor shortage we discussed in an earlier update, the one that left Ukraine's own air defenses badly strained because Middle East demand was pulling from the same global interceptor stockpile, isn't just a Ukraine story, it's a preview of the same structural vulnerability now playing out closer to the actual fighting in the Gulf, where American, Israeli, and allied Gulf state defenses are all drawing on interceptor supplies that aren't infinite and aren't quickly replaceable. So here's what I'd actually watch for specifically heading into Tuesday and the days just after it. Watch whether anything concrete comes out of the Trump-Netanyahu meeting beyond the expected photos and statements of solidarity, since the timing relative to the tanker dispersal and shelter reopenings makes this one of the more consequential single meetings of the entire war, regardless of how it's being publicly framed as primarily about attending a funeral. Watch whether Iran makes any visible move toward the negotiating table before whatever deadline Trump is currently operating under expires, given Rubio's more than proportional language this week, since that phrase reads like a warning shot aimed specifically at making the cost of continued refusal as clear as possible. And watch the tanker and aircraft dispersal numbers specifically over the coming days, since a further buildup would tell you preparations for a larger operation are continuing on schedule, while any drawdown would suggest either a genuine diplomatic opening has emerged or that the assessed threat level has eased for reasons that haven't yet been made public. And that's really the through line I'd leave you with across everything we've covered tonight, from the Special Forces planning story down to the tanker count. None of these individual pieces of evidence proves on its own that a major new phase of this war is imminent, but taken together. The logistics buildup, the shelter reopenings, the hardliner ascendancy inside Tehran, and the timing of Tuesday's meeting, they're all consistent with a genuine inflection point rather than just another data point in an already long-running war. And that's exactly the kind of moment where getting the details right matters more than getting to the headline first, because the tanker numbers specifically are more informative than they might first appear. 100 aerial refueling tankers positioned across a theater is not the footprint of a force planning another routine night of the kind of strikes we've been tracking for weeks now. It's closer to the scale of infrastructure you'd expect ahead of a much larger, sustained air campaign, potentially involving long-range bomber missions, requiring multiple in-air refuelings per sortie, extended fighter patrols, or a broader simultaneous push across several fronts at once. Tankers are, in a sense, one of the more honest indicators available in open-source military tracking, precisely because they're logistics infrastructure rather than combat platforms. A government can talk tough without necessarily meaning it, but it's much harder to fake the kind of refueling capacity buildup that would actually be needed to sustain a genuinely larger operation, which is part of why independent analysts treat this specific category of movement as a meaningfully stronger signal than rhetoric alone, because I think it deserves more room than the single sentence I gave it earlier, since it may actually be the most important piece of context for understanding why this war keeps failing to move toward a settlement even during periods when both governments are technically still talking. A regime whose most powerful internal faction believes, and is reportedly gaining ground in arguing, that the entire reason Iran has suffered the strikes, the assassinated leadership, and the sustained bombing campaign of the past 5 months is that it didn't already possess a deliverable nuclear weapon, is a regime with a genuinely dangerous logic pulling it toward doubling down rather than negotiating away the program. That's a very different starting point than a government that views its nuclear ambitions as a bargaining chip to be traded for sanctions relief or security guarantees, the assumption that's implicitly underneath most of the diplomatic frameworks, including the original memorandum, that have been attempted throughout this war. If the hardliners telling themselves the lesson of this war is get the bomb faster, not give up, The program are genuinely ascendant inside Tehran's power structure right now. That helps explain a pattern we've noted repeatedly across this series. Technical talks continuing in the background, even while the substantive gap between the two sides never seems to close, because the Iranian side may increasingly view any serious concession on the nuclear question as strategically suicidal regardless of what economic relief is offered in exchange. It also puts Mojtaba Khamenei's own reported nuclear ambitions, which we discussed in the previous update, in a fuller context. A new supreme leader who was personally injured in the strike that killed his father, operating inside a security establishment where the loudest internal voices are reportedly arguing that only a deliverable weapon prevents a repeat of exactly what happened to him and his father, is about as unfavorable a starting position for a negotiated nuclear rollback as you could design if you were trying to engineer one. None of that means diplomacy is definitively dead. Wars this complicated rarely move in a single, irreversible direction for long. And internal factions inside Iran's government have shifted in influence before and could again. But it does mean that anyone expecting a quick diplomatic breakthrough simply because both sides keep describing back-channel talks as ongoing should probably recalibrate those expectations against what this reporting suggests about the actual internal politics driving Tehran's decision-making right now, which looks, at least based on tonight's evidence, considerably more hardened than it did even a few weeks ago. Because it deserves more than a single passing mention. And it's the part that's genuinely useful to understand, regardless of how any individual mission might be carried out. The core tension experts have been wrestling with publicly for months now is this. Airstrikes, even extremely powerful ones using the largest conventional bunker busters in the American arsenal, have already been tried against Iran's major nuclear sites once, during last year's Operation Midnight Hammer, and Iran's response wasn't to give up its program, it was to adapt, hardening what could be hardened and relocating what could be relocated into exactly the kind of deep, fortified sites like Pickaxe Mountain that are hardest to reach again from the air. That adaptation is the entire reason a ground option is back on the table as a serious policy conversation, rather than something dismissed out of hand, because if bombing alone reliably solved this problem, nobody at CSIS or inside the West Wing would be talking about the alternative. But the ground option carries its own, very different category of risk, not the risk of failing to destroy a facility, but the risk of American troops fighting and potentially dying deep inside hostile, defended Iranian territory, far from any friendly border, in an operation that even its own proponents describe as carrying a real chance of becoming the next Eagle Claw, rather than the next successful high-risk raid. That's the actual decision Washington is wrestling with, not a simple question of toughness or resolve, but a genuine trade-off between two categories of risk that don't map onto each other cleanly. Strategic risk from a program that keeps surviving airstrikes against tactical and human risk from committing ground forces to one of the most dangerous environments the U.S. military could choose to operate in. I think that's the frame worth carrying out of tonight's update, more than any specific detail about which unit might theoretically be involved, because it's the frame that actually explains why this debate keeps resurfacing every few weeks without ever quite resolving, and why Tuesday's meeting between two men who've spent this entire war weighing exactly this kind of trade-off carries as much weight as it does, because I think it's worth being transparent about that choice rather than just quietly making it. Across this entire series, we've tried to hold a consistent line between reporting on real significant developments, even ones involving deeply sensitive military planning, and actually functioning as a source of operational detail about an active conflict. That line gets genuinely harder to hold the deeper this war goes, and the more granular the public reporting around it becomes, because outlets covering this story competitively have real incentives to publish increasingly specific details, and a channel trying to summarize that coverage faces a real temptation to just repeat whatever's out there, rather than making an independent judgment about what's actually appropriate to pass along. I think the right test, the one I've tried to apply consistently, is whether a piece of information helps you understand the strategic picture and the stakes involved, which a citizen in a democracy genuinely has a right to know about a war being fought partly in their name, versus whether it functions as a usable operational detail about a real, current target, which doesn't actually inform your understanding of the war in any way that matters, and just adds risk without adding insight. Tonight's story sits closer to that second category than almost anything else we've covered in this series, given how specific some of the circulating reporting has gotten about entry points and force composition for two named real facilities in an active conflict, and I'd rather be the channel that draws that line consistently than the one that blurs it because a competitor already did.